I know. 14 nanometers? What are you going to do? Are we locked into 5.2, 5.3 gigahertz? What's the upper end? What's the upper limit? There's new 14 nanometer processors coming from Intel. What do we do to get the clocks higher? I've got an idea. Coolermaster and Intel have teamed up. See on the end of the box? They've teamed up. This is the MasterLiquid ML360 Sub-Zero Thermoelectric Liquid Cooler. Yeah, that's right. We can go sub-ambient with Sub-Zero. You know, Sub-Zero. No, not that Sub-Zero. That was inspired by the Mortal Kombat theme, which was similar to, but for the purposes of copyright, wholly distinct from the Mortal Kombat theme. Alright, at first blush, this might look like just a normal AIO, but in fact, it's not. The pump is separate from the actual junction. So this uses a Peltier junction to cool your CPU. Spoiler alert, this is not going to let you run 5.8 gigahertz on all 10 cores on a 10900K or even anything beyond. Part of that is because this just doesn't have the cooling capacity to do that, because you would be dumping upwards of 500 watts into the CPU at that point, but the socket just can't deliver that much power to the CPU. But you can boost your single thread clocks. You're going to be dumping a lot of watts through that 14 nanometer process into 1 or 2 cores or 3 cores. If you want the land speed record for CPU single clock and you don't want to go liquid nitrogen, this is probably for you. So this is a product for somebody that is pushing the envelope and not afraid to murder your CPU, or somebody that just wants to run their CPU at sub-ambient temperatures. I mean, this is a product that doesn't make sense unless you're going to overclock. You can have a lot of fun with this. I mean, I don't think it would be unfair to say that this is one of the most fun products that I have ever tested, but I don't recommend for general consumption. I mean, it kind of makes sense though if you think about it. If you're going to buy something like this, which is a tremendous amount of fun. I mean, if you've got time to kill and you want to mess around with stuff like this, this was a crazy amount of fun to play with. But, you know, is this a thing? I don't know. The single most impressive thing about this is how stable it could keep the temperature of the CPU. It was shockingly impressive. Basically, if your CPU was mostly okay, but occasionally you brush up against those like 95 degrees C, you know, temperature zones where you may be hurting your CPU, this was really good about sort of taking the edge off those instances when you're doing overclocking. So this is also kind of a product maybe for experienced overclockers, because you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, you don't necessarily know what you're getting into. Because by the time you spend on this cooler and the highest end motherboard and the highest end CPU and the highest end everything else, you could have probably purchased an even more high end system. But the engineering that Coolermaster has done with this thing, it really is incredible. I mean, this is going to go down in the history books as one of the best, you know, relatively compact sub-ambient cooling systems that there is. I mean, there's the older systems, which were, you know, like external, like you had a, you know, a really heavy brick that sat outside your case, and it would do sub-ambient cooling, and, you know, those sort of went down in the history books. Those were legendary. I never got my hands on one of those. But this, they can have this back when they pry it from my cold, dead hands, because it really is a lot of fun to play with without getting into liquid nitrogen and some of the other stuff. I mean, I think I had the most fun with this on a 10600K. So setting this up with a 10600K and trying to push it to like 5.8 gigahertz on like 2 cores, that was a lot of fun. I accidentally murdered that CPU, but it was a lot of fun. This is a product that has a 5-year warranty, so Coolermaster's definitely got some confidence there. Now, in case you're wondering, does this come with AM4 mounting hardware? No, it does not. There's no AM4 mounting hardware. What did you think it? No, of course. Now, the one thing I was surprised about is there's also no 2011 mounting hardware. 2011-3, it's right out. I'm gonna try to cool the 10980XE with this. Ha ha ha. No. Now, this cooler really is. Now, this cooler really is absolutely ridiculous. It actually has a rubber seal, a gasket, to go around the motherboard. Why would it have that? Well, sub-ambient cooling, condensation may be a real worry. Now, it tries to monitor the temperature to try to prevent condensation, but, you know, there it is. And that's part of the reason why it doesn't come with AM4 or 2011 mounting hardware, is because you would need technically a little bit of a different bracket here. And the way that the copper is machined, well, the 2011 contact area on those larger CPUs is a little bigger. So this is definitely designed for those really hot running 14 nanometer CPUs. I mean, this is basically designed for the 14 nanometer process, which is, you know, here to stay for, you know, current 10th gen, 11th gen, maybe even 12th gen. It's the direction we're headed. Also, how cool is it that the cold plate requires a 12 volt PCIe power connection? Goodness gracious me. So for our test system that we're using the ASRock Z490 Tai-Chi. Why? Well, it's got these killer fans on the VRM. It's also got a pretty solid VRM implementation, so we can dump hundreds of watts into our plucky little Intel 10900K, our retail 10900K. This is a nice CPU. This is a good setup. This is a good board for it. It's kudos all around. Installation in our fractal case here, not really a big deal. It's pretty straightforward. One really clever thing that Coolermaster has done is the screws for the fans are actually threaded. So these are thumb screws that hold the fans to the radiator, but then you can put a set of screws inside the thumb screws. In this way, you can actually mount the pump to the fan and still have it secured, you know, the fan secured to the radiator. So that works really well. Although in the fractal case, I'd probably flip the fans around the other way so that they're intake rather than exhaust. But these are also really high static pressure fans. You can definitely hear the pump running. You can definitely see that cold plate running. You gotta run that PCIe power. It's a little weird in this case. I think if I would do this over and try to cable manage this, I would bring that PCIe power cable for the cold plate up and over and behind the motherboard. I think that would probably work out well for this particular build. Now the initial setup, of course, you just get this weird little red light on the cold plate, and it doesn't seem like the cold plate's working from looking at the info in Hardware 64. What you have to do, you got to download some drivers. You need to download the Coolermaster software and install it on Windows to really have things take off and be able to get more fine-grained control and understand what's up with the cold plate, the pump, temperatures, and how hard you want it to work. Now, as Coolermaster says on their own website, you know, the temperature difference here is really under light load, is when it will really bring the temperature down. But I think that that's a little misleading because, you know, if your CPU is running at 100 watts or less, it's basically idling. And yeah, it's going to be at 16 degrees C, but it's idling. That doesn't really, you know, I mean, I guess that's good, but that's not really a thing. But, you know, as you can see, when it gets under full load, basically it's equivalent to a 360 millimeter all-in-one. But again, where I think this thing really shines is when you're running like 2 cores, maybe 4 cores, at a really ridiculously high clock speed, because you can use it to dial in even more stability. This is really only good for doing benchmarks and getting, you know, straight to the top of the leaderboard. So our test system here with the ASRock Z490, we've also got our Founders RTX 3090, beastly 3090. And this is the setup that we use for all of our testing and confirmation. Once you got the Coolermaster software installed and you've got it doing what it should do, then you can run the Intel XTU software. Now the Intel XTU software definitely supports that ASRock Z490 motherboard right out of the box, and it's gonna dial in whatever frequency it can get stable, and wow, it really is stable. Now pro tip, when you're running XTU, turn XMP off. I don't know why, but you can turn XMP off and get a better clock running XTU. Then you wanna turn XMP back on after it's done, and you should be pretty stable. Now, let's talk for a second about price. I kind of alluded to this, but this is an expensive piece of kit. If you want to do sub-ambient and you're going to spend this much money, you could do a custom loop that has some sub-ambient components externally, but you'll be spending a few $100 more. Although maybe it's worth it, or maybe it's not worth it. I don't know. This is a lot of fun to play with. This is definitely for a particular kind of customer. This is definitely not a general recommendation because you're spending as much on the cooling as you have on your CPU, or maybe more. So, you know, keep that in mind. This is a lot of fun to play with, and this is one of those toys where you guys are welcome to come over to my house and play with this together, and we'll enjoy it together. You don't need to own it, you can just watch me play with it and get just as much enjoyment out of it, unless you're going to go against me for those records on like Firestrike and you know, the 3D Mark benchmarks, in which case I'm coming for you. Another kind of weird thing that I'll point out that sort of washed out in testing is you need this link on this sheet of paper to download the software. If you just go to Coolermaster's website and download Master Plus, which is what I initially expected to do, being familiar with Coolermaster's products, which are quite good, no, you need this. And you're going to be downloading something called the Intel Cryo software. It's from Coolermaster. I mean, Coolermaster, they really know what they're doing. So I did think it was a bit weird that I can't use Master Plus. I need the Intel Cryo utilities. So it goes with that whole Intel theme. This is pretty much for LGA 1200 and beyond, because, well, 14 nanometer, it's here to stay. That Intel installer, also kind of buggy. In fact, Windows Smart Screen was like, hey, I don't recognize this, you probably shouldn't run it, which is kind of funny because it's actually from Intel. And it also bombed out the first time because it said that I didn't plug in the USB cable, when in fact Device Manager shows I did plug in the USB cable. It just doesn't have a driver because Windows Update hadn't downloaded the driver for it yet. I feel like this hasn't had a lot of quality control on the software side, which is disappointing because Coolermaster has brought their A game for the cooler hardware. Now you might be wondering, how much power does this cooler consume with its active cooling? Upwards of 250 watts. When you're figuring your power supply configuration, figure an extra 250 watts just for the cooler. One cool thing about this that it has built in is a dew point. It's aware of the dew point, so it doesn't make it so cold that it's going to condensate. Of course, you can run it in unregulated mode, which will give you maximum cooling, but there is a chance of condensation, and condensation will short things out, and there's no warranty, and blah, blah, blah. So definitely don't do unregulated mode unless you really, really know what you're doing. But that's why it has the rubber seal, but you can still get condensation on the back of the motherboard, depending, especially when the CPU is not idle. But still, for adding only 0.12 volts to our 10900K here and being able to achieve 5.4 gigahertz and being able to do gaming and get a little bit of a performance bump, I mean, I don't think anybody's buying a 3090 to do 1080p gaming with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but if you are, you can get quite a nice performance bump in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at that, 1080p frame rate because you're lowering the round trip time and you can boost your frame rate by just a little bit. But like I say, this is for benchmarking and just getting some pretty numbers on a graph, not, you could do it everyday usage, but I mean, that's a really expensive cooler to use for everyday usage. But man, this is a lot of fun. Now, one really disappointing thing is the Intel Performance Maximizer is completely not compatible with this. The Intel Performance Maximizer reboots your machine, and for whatever reason, Intel didn't include that functionality in their software. So when the Cryo software is not running in Windows, the Cryo thing is not operational. You have to be running the software in Windows in order for the Cryo thing to do its thing. So Linux, I mean, you can actually run the software under Linux because it's just a USB device, but I don't really want to get into that because it doesn't work like you think it does, but you could theoretically do it because it's a USB device. But let's not talk about that. But that's another nail in the coffin in using this cooler on another platform, like say X299 or something else. It's really just designed for the 10th and 11th gen processors. And I know 11th gen's not here yet, at least at the time that I'm shooting this video. It's right around the corner, and this might be super handy for it because I never would have thought I could get 5.4 or 5.5 on my 10900K. And that's a retail chip, it's retail. It's better than my Intel also sent a sample, and I played around with the Intel sample. This is better than the sample, but this is also a really recent 10900K, so hey, maybe the process is improving. Now I gotta say, after tweaking and tuning and taking the reins off, this is much more insane than I really expected. Okay, so we're working with the Tai Chi, and you gotta kind of take the reins off the Tai Chi a little bit. It's actually got some safeties to try to prevent you from melting your processor. So once I enable the full OC mode so I can dump, 350 watts, let's say, into this 10900K, this cryogenic cooler really showed its stuff. I mean, it was over 200 watts, 250 watts at times, but the dividends, it paid off. 5.6 gigahertz on up to 2 cores, all the way down to 5.3 gigahertz all-core. Although that 5.3 gigahertz all-core, I don't know that it could sustain that for long periods of time. But for running benchmarks and even longer gaming sessions that have those burst speeds up to 5.6 gigahertz, this could do it. I left it in a loop of, the Tomb Raider built-in benchmark just running over and over again. I left it overnight because I was like, surely this is not going to last overnight. And it did. It lasted overnight. It was at least stable enough overnight. It's not a perfectly stable system at that speed, doing literally anything. But it did last long enough. And I probably shouldn't call it Shirley, but I think that's its new name. Shirley, the little processor that could. And the rest of our setup, other than, the ASRock Taichi motherboard and the 10900K, our memory certainly helps. It's DDR4 4000. This is actually from Crucial. It's Crucial Ballistics. I'm going to be including that in another video, kind of a head-to-head shootout, fast memory. It's clocked fast, but the timings are kind of loose. Like timings versus the other stuff, how much of a difference does that make? There's kind of a lot to that. That's a story for another day. But I've actually, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit how much fun I've had with this, because is this a system that I can get real work done on? No, not at all. But this is also the only system that I've ever seen that is, stable at more than 5.3 gigahertz for, until you run out of liquid nitrogen. The tech in here, that's a pun because it's a TEC, thermoelectric cooler, see what I did, is actually really impressive. Coolermaster has done an exceptional job putting this hardware together. There's other little annoyances with the Intel software too, other than the ones that I've already mentioned. Like if you have cryo mode turned on and you need to reboot, well, it'll remember the overclock in the Intel Extreme Tuning utility, but it doesn't necessarily reapply cryo mode until the software loads. That's incredibly dumb. The software should have a feature where it's like, just run in cryo mode all the time. I mean, I know the whole dew point thing, and maybe that's a concern. Maybe don't drop it down to like 16 degrees C, just drop it down to like 45 degrees C when you're in the, I don't know, the software's rebooting, I don't know what's going on. Because you can totally have a stable, safe overclock, but then sometimes it'll just shut off. Because it's not completely, perfectly 100% stable, but it's pretty darn good. Geekbench on 10 cores with a little fiddling, 1477, 1484, close to 1500. If I push the memory clocks a little bit, it's all down to the memory side of things now to tune for stability, which is one of the reasons why I recommend disabling XMP before you dial it in, because you could actually be facing a memory instability, not a CPU instability, so you don't want to dump extra voltage into your CPU. There's then heat you got to get rid of when it's not a problem with your CPU. It can be a lot of fun to play with this stuff. It can also be a black hole of time, a distraction from actually having a working computer, but it is a lot of fun. Ultimately, it's up to you. Do you want something that you can kind of fiddle around with sub-ambient cooling? It's a toy. It's something that is to be experimented with. I don't know that it's for everyday use. It's also a little louder than you would get with a normal 360 AIO. You can definitely hear the pump motor going. It's a high velocity operation, it seems. But like I say, this was a surprising amount of fun. I had a lot more enjoyment out of messing with all this and turning all the knobs than I really thought that I would, and trying to get higher and higher and higher Geekbench scores on this platform. I wonder if tech cooling is going to be the future, or if, things like ARM are going to take over the world, because, impressive things are possible in 5 watts apparently. But 250 watts for the cooler, 250 watts for the CPU, 500 watts for the GPU. We're starting to have problems fitting in the North American electrical code for a single electrical outlet at that point. I'm Modulus Level 1. This has been a quick look at all that. I had a lot of fun with this. Join me in the forums at Level 1. If you have one of these setups or you're messing around with this kind of stuff, I'd love to hear from you. I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.